Greetings everyone, Arcimedes here, and welcome back to another brick-filled LEGO video. Today, we're going to be taking a closer look at my own creation, Aquanauts themed pinball machine, especially looking at the various Technic elements and design tips and tricks. So, let's get started, shall we? Here is my Aquanauts themed pinball machine. Now, if you've seen my Asteroids themed pinball machine, you might remember at the end of the video, I said something to the effect that design comes in stages. You can't always come up with the perfect model on the first try. Remember something like that? Well, this model is my second try. My previous pinball machine was merely a prototype, and now here is at least a much better draft. I think it looks so much better. So let's just take a closer look at some of the details within the model. The flippers are almost exactly the same as the flippers in the Asteroids pinball machine. They use the same universal joint and gear design to help them rotate and flip. If you want to know how I built them, just take a look at my first pinball machine. However, there were some other things that I did indeed change when creating this pinball machine. For example, the plunger. As you can see here, it's a much more compact design. It doesn't have this whole big bulging point at the top here, and it's a lot easier to pull back. You can pull it back with one hand, while the other required you to brace it with both hands. Otherwise, the whole machine would pull apart. Here is the plunger from my first pinball machine. It did have a great amount of power, but that amount of power required it to have this very big, bulky frame to hold these shock absorbers in place. It also had a tendency to bow backwards. So when I began designing this, my second pinball machine, I decided I wanted to improve upon this design. After a bit of experimenting, which is to say, launching balls across my room, I figured out that a shock absorber, just one, would provide enough power to launch the ball up the chute and into the main board. With this fact in mind, I began designing a very simple plunger design off the basic principles of my first one, but drastically shrinking it down to a much smaller scale. Since the design was less powerful, I was able to use a much simpler and much more elegant design for the pull on the plunger, and also was able to only use half beams to brace the one end of the plunger in place. Since the design was so compact, I was able to fit it into my final pinball machine much more elegantly, without any Technic elements sticking out. And yet, despite having only one cylinder, the plunger is able to easily launch a ball across the board. Isn't the power of prototyping wonderful? And yet, this design is not quite perfect. If you pull back the plunger all the way, it can often get stuck, as you can see here, not launching the ball all the way up. What happens is that when the plunger is depressed, when it's pulled back, the bottom end slides down, jams into the channel beneath, and it isn't able to move forward very far or very quickly. You then have to press the joint in order to launch the ball again. Just like everything in Technic, there's always a little element that can be improved. One of my favorite tricks I used in this model is one you can't actually see in the final model. When I built my Asteroids themed pinball machine, I built it the board and the walls together like this, so that it was one giant structure. Now, that's great when it makes a very strong model like this. However, if you want to try to break it apart to work on the board, you have to disassemble the entire sides of the model to try to get to it, which, as you can see, can be very traumatic for your model. This is destroying the whole thing. So when I mentally designed this model, I decided I would make the board and the walls separately. I would make the board with an extra brick on the outside, wider than the board size itself. And then the walls would have a groove into which the board could fit. So the board could slide along those grooves. It would fit in place so you could see how the board looks with the sides, but you could easily slide it apart to work on the individual sections of the board. When I completed the design, I could use a few pieces on the bottom and the top of the board to lock it in place. Building in segments is another great way to design a good solid model. One of my favorite aesthetic details in this model is this little underwater cave underneath the aqua base itself. Now, I had originally just wanted some sort of textured pieces to make the rock face on top of which the aqua base would sit. But as I began designing it, and realizing where it would have to sit, I realized that I would have to have a trough for the balls to roll through onto the flippers. As I began considering how I would do this, I was inspired to use a few simple arched pieces that one could find in any ordinary castle set, and stacked them in layers to make a slightly open cave system, where you could kind of see the ball rolling behind it. The other design I'm particularly proud of is the arch, which I used to cover the tubing that created the curve for the balls to roll on. Now, in some of my other designs, I had used a simple 1x1 beam to cover the top of the tubing, and I didn't really like the way it looked. It didn't mask it very well, at least from the top view. So when I was designing this subassembly, I decided I would go out on a limb and make a slight change. As you can see here, the little black detail underneath extends 1/2 stud farther than the yellow plate. What I did was simply replacing the traditional 1x plates with these gutter pieces, which LEGO uses for a variety of different sets. Because they are 1 1/2 stud wide, I was able to fit them and extend them just slightly farther out from the top than a single 1x, which helped to disguise the tubing underneath a little better. But before I conclude, I'd like to take one brief look at one of the more subtle but most spectacular achievements in this model. In this and my previous pinball machine, I used LEGO bricks on their side with connections like this. Now, this is generally fine. You can do this in almost any model. However, there is one thing you must consider. When LEGO bricks are placed on their side, especially if they're bearing a great weight, they have a tendency to bow and eventually snap apart, like this. In my previous pinball machine, the whole weight of all that LEGO pressing down upon these individual 8-stud connections eventually tore the machine in half, making it practically unplayable. Since I really liked this particular model, and I didn't want it to snap to pieces, I decided to create a new method for bracing the LEGO pieces so that they wouldn't snap apart. That method was very simple. After I finished building the model, I simply placed Technic beams across the spans of LEGO bricks. This held the pieces together. Now, if you try to bow the pieces, it's very hard to actually separate them because the beams hold them in place. If you look closely on my board, you can see the Technic beams running along the main frame of the board. These help to hold the frame together so it doesn't rip apart. Although this is a very, very simple trick, using beams to bind columns of LEGO bricks together is very useful in supporting your LEGO models, especially the big ones. Now, technically, what these beams do are hold this column of bricks in compression. They don't allow tension force to tear them apart. But the wonderful world of tension and compression shall be left for a later episode. So there you go, ladies and gentlemen. These are my basic design notes and tricks that I found when creating my Aquanauts themed pinball machine. If you want to see some footage of gameplay and some general conversation about the pinball machine, please click the link in the description. Also, although I managed to talk about some of the design elements in this model, I skimmed over a lot of other things. If you have any questions, please comment me, and I'll be happy to respond. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you liked this video. I hope that was interesting, or informative, or at least that it entertained you for a little while. If you did in fact like this video, please comment, rate, or subscribe. If you didn't like this video, still, please comment and rate. And if you really want, you can subscribe too. Point is, I want to hear what you think would make this channel and this video, and this model, different and better. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I bid you all farewell. My name is Arcimedes36, and I'll see you next Sunday.